They laughed before he even opened his mouth. The moment he stepped through the station doors, wearing his pressed uniform, head held high, eyes calm but watchful, every conversation stopped. Then came the smirks, the exchanged glances, the barely hidden whispers. He wasn't one of them. Not because he was new, not because he didn't know the protocols, but because of the color of his skin. And in that room, filled with badges and egos, that was all that mattered. Someone dropped a file on his desk and scoffed, "You lost, man. Maintenance room's 2 floors down." Laughter erupted. Another officer chimed in, "Hope you brought your mop. These floors get filthy by midday." Then a third voice, older, more venomous, said with a smirk, "Welcome to the force, rookie. First rule. Stay in your place." He didn't speak. Not yet. He didn't react. He simply looked around, at each one of them, and memorized the faces. They didn't know. They thought they were dealing with another diversity hire, someone they could mock, test, break. Someone they could reduce with sarcastic smiles and humiliating errands. They thought he was there to learn. They had no idea he was there to lead. The orders he was handed were intentional, designed to break him before he had a chance to stand. Coffee runs. Tire changes. Menial paperwork stacked to the ceiling. When he tried to sit at the briefing table, they told him that seat was reserved for command, laughing under their breath as if the very idea of him sitting there was a joke. Someone even scribbled a note on his locker that read, "Token." Just that. Nothing more. But it said everything. The uniform didn't protect him. The badge didn't grant him dignity. His silence didn't buy him respect. Every day was another test, another insult, another reminder that they didn't see him as an equal, only as a shadow in the wrong room. But they didn't know who he was. He had walked in quietly, intentionally, under the radar. He allowed the charade, allowed the cruelty, allowed the sneers. Because he needed to see the truth for himself. He needed to feel it, witness it, and let them reveal who they really were when they thought no one of value was watching. The truth is, he wasn't just the new guy. He was their new chief. And every smirk, every degrading word, every task meant to shame him was not only a display of their prejudice, but a nail in the coffin of their careers. He had been appointed by the governor himself, hand-picked after a long and silent internal investigation into misconduct, abuse of power, and deeply rooted racism in that very precinct. What better way to uncover the rot than by sending someone who could see it, feel it, and survive it? Still, even with all the power behind him, he didn't lead with a fist. He led with patience. But that patience, it was running out. As the days passed, the humiliations escalated. One officer, accidentally, spilled coffee on his reports, another, forgot, to invite him to a critical tactical meeting. When he showed up anyway, they laughed in his face. Didn't know the janitor was interested in ops planning, one of them whispered, loud enough for the entire room to hear. He stood there, silent, steady. He watched them all grin, watched their eyes sparkle with arrogance. And still, he said nothing. Because he was waiting. Waiting for the moment the curtain would fall. Waiting for the precise second when their laughter would die in their throats. Waiting for the truth to hit them like a bullet they never saw coming. And that moment, it came. In the middle of the department's quarterly review, in front of every officer, admin, and city official, the precinct's command room doors opened. A man in a suit entered, followed by 2 others carrying sealed folders. The smirking stopped. The whispering vanished. Silence choked the air. The governor's seal was on the folder. And when the suit turned to address the room, calling forward the newly appointed chief of the 7th precinct, all eyes searched for someone else. Anyone else. But it was him who stood. Calmly. Quietly. He walked to the front, took the badge from the governor's representative, and turned to face the room. No one laughed this time. Their faces crumbled. Mouths fell open. Eyes darted away. One officer stepped back as if he'd seen a ghost. Another paled, remembering the words he'd said just the day before. Every chuckle, every insult, every email, every smirk, they all flashed before them now in terrifying clarity. Because now, he was in charge. And he remembered everything. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they were protected. They thought the department was theirs to control, theirs to stain with silent racism and unchecked authority. But now the tables had turned. And the man they tried to humiliate into silence was about to clean house, with strategy, with discipline, and with justice sharpened like a blade. How many would be fired? How many secrets would be exposed? And what would he do, with the one officer who crossed the line too far? One thing was clear, the station would never be the same again. But the real question is, when justice walks into the room wearing a badge, how do the guilty survive it? Stay with us. The story is just getting started. Before we begin today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every black viewer watching this video. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, discrimination, and hate. We believe in justice, dignity, and the right for everyone to be respected, no matter their skin color. If you've ever been made to feel less than because of who you are, please know, you are seen, you are valued, and you matter deeply. Now, get ready for a story that will move you, shake you, and inspire you, because karma doesn't miss. Subscribe to the channel, and let's dive into a journey full of twists, truth, and power. Enjoy the story. The city of Augusta, Georgia, with its cracked sidewalks and quiet hum of southern life, had always worn two faces. One for the public eye, charming, traditional, proud. And another for those who looked closer, those who lived within the quiet pockets of inequality that never made it into the tourism brochures. Tension didn't scream here, it simmered. In the streets, in the glances, in the expectations. The 7th precinct sat nestled just off a main road near a row of worn-down storefronts and aging oak trees, the station itself a tired two-story building whose bricks seemed to carry the weight of every injustice that had ever passed through its doors. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee, cheap cologne, and decades of power left unchecked. Malik Thompson had spent much of his adult life walking through doors like this one. He had worn the uniform longer than many of the officers in that station had even considered a career in law enforcement. But nothing could have prepared him for how it felt to return to the South, not as someone passing through, not as someone enforcing policy, but as someone sent to change what was rotten at its core. He hadn't grown up in Augusta, but he knew towns like it. Towns where your skin walked into the room before your name did. Towns where people smiled at you in public and dismissed you in private. Towns where being a black man in a position of authority meant you were tolerated, never accepted. At 43, Malik had earned his stripes the long way. Starting as a patrol officer in New Jersey, he had taken every difficult assignment that came his way. He wasn't flashy. He didn't make headlines. But he built a reputation for integrity and intelligence, for being the kind of man who listened more than he spoke and never forgot a face. The kind of man who made enemies slowly, but once he did, they never forgot why. His rise through the ranks wasn't clean, nothing in law enforcement ever was, but he kept his head down and played the long game. That long game was what brought him here. The governor's office had recruited him under confidentiality, warning him of the systemic issues within the 7th precinct, a place where complaints disappeared, officers were protected by silence, and black residents often feared the very people meant to protect them. He was given one task, clean house, but do it from the inside out. To achieve that, Malik had agreed to something few men in his position ever would, arrive undercover. Let them think he was new. Let them show him who they really were. And they did, almost immediately. On his first day, he walked in wearing a standard-issue uniform, no fanfare, no ceremony. Just another rookie, as they called him. No one asked about his background. No one questioned his age. No one looked twice at his commendations, his years of service. Because they weren't looking for those things. They were looking for ways to keep him beneath them. Malik didn't expect a welcome parade, but the level of casual disrespect was jarring. The first to greet him, or rather, haze him, was Officer Chad Barker, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp jawline and a voice that always seemed to carry a sarcastic tone, even when he wasn't trying. Chad was the kind of man who had never been told no in his life, and when he saw Malik, he smiled with the smugness of someone who thought they were at the top of the food chain. "Hope you like cleaning up," Chad had said, tossing him a stained clipboard and motioning toward the old cruiser parked outside. "She's all yours, rookie. Smells like vomit, but hey, welcome to the team." The others followed suit, laughing behind their hands, watching to see how the new guy would respond. Sergeant Rick Holloway, older, slower, but twice as bitter, made a point to give Malik a tour that somehow skipped over the strategy room and the intel center. He pointed out the break room, the locker area, the supply closet. "Don't get lost," he muttered with a smirk. Malik didn't respond. He simply nodded, memorized the layout, and logged the behavior in the back of his mind. Then there was Officer Danielle "Danny" Reeves. One of the few women in the precinct, she held her own among the men, but her complicity spoke louder than any joke. She laughed when they laughed, watched when they mocked. Whether it was out of survival or alignment, Malik wasn't sure yet. But she was dangerous in a different way. Quiet, calculating. A shadow among louder wolves. Not everyone joined in the humiliation, but no one stopped it. That, Malik noted, was worse. The only genuine moment came from an older janitor named Elijah, who passed him in the hallway on the second day. With a knowing look and a slight nod, he muttered under his breath, "Don't let them see you break. That's what they want." It was the only thing close to kindness Malik had received since he walked in. In those first few weeks, Malik learned everything he needed to know. Reports were mishandled. Complaints from black citizens were lost or quietly redirected. Body cam footage was mysteriously corrupted in sensitive incidents. Officers like Chad treated every interaction with civilians like a performance for their peers, more concerned with dominance than de-escalation. Rick, the sergeant, operated like a gatekeeper, ensuring no outside scrutiny penetrated the culture they had built. The station functioned less like a public service and more like a private club, and membership came at the cost of your conscience. Meanwhile, Malik played the role. He stayed quiet. Took the assignments. Laughed when they expected him to. Listened when they thought he wasn't. Every insult, every slight, it was a thread in a much larger tapestry he was weaving behind the scenes. The difference was, they were too arrogant to see it. Too blind to imagine that someone they viewed as beneath them was, in fact, above them in every way that mattered. Outside the precinct, Augusta moved on. The community remained unaware of what was coming. Malik didn't speak to anyone about his real purpose, not the mayor, not the city council, not the local press. He was a ghost in plain sight. But every day, he documented. Every incident. Every joke. Every violation of protocol. His internal report grew by the hour. He wasn't just preparing to lead, he was preparing to rebuild. And yet, despite his resolve, Malik felt the weight of it. The emotional toll of swallowing his pride, of being treated like less than a man, of watching injustice thrive in the open, it sat heavy on his chest. At night, he'd sit in his rented apartment, looking out over the city lights, wondering how many others had come before him and walked away in silence. Wondering how many had tried and failed to change what didn't want to be changed. And still, he pressed forward. Because this wasn't about pride. This was about legacy. Each officer revealed themselves in different ways. Chad was aggressive and loud, constantly needing an audience. Rick was subtler, manipulative, always with one hand on his clipboard and another on the pulse of any threat to the status quo. Danny was slippery, always just within the lines of policy, never quite stepping over, just enough to be unaccountable. Others followed their lead, eager to stay in the good graces of the ones in charge. As the weeks passed, Malik could feel a shift in himself. Not anger, he had long since mastered that. But resolve. The kind that builds not from fury, but from purpose. Every injustice became a page in his strategy. Every act of disrespect became a data point. And he knew the time would come when all of it, all the laughter, the assumptions, the cruelty, would be returned to them, not with vengeance, but with consequence. Because while they believed he was just another pawn in their broken system, Malik was building a new board altogether. And when it was ready, he would flip the whole game. But what none of them knew, not even the ones who suspected something was off, was how close that moment really was. And when it came, would they be ready to face the man they tried so hard to break? Or would the foundation they stood on crumble beneath them, before they even saw it coming? Let's find out. Malik sat in the back of the precinct's outdated conference room, the overhead lights flickering faintly above him as Sergeant Holloway ran through the morning's assignments like he'd done every week for the last 20 years. It was the same monotone delivery, the same bored expressions around the table, but Malik's eyes didn't rest on the clipboard in front of him, they drifted to the faces. Every smirk, every nod, every narrowed glance held a different layer of calculation. These men and women had built a system that thrived in shadows, a culture insulated from consequences. And none of them had the slightest idea that the man they were still treating as invisible was the one writing the final chapter of that culture. "Reeves, you're with Thompson again," Holloway grunted without looking up. Danny didn't hide the irritation in her eyes, but she shrugged and offered a forced smirk in Malik's direction. "Don't slow me down, rookie," she said under her breath as they exited the room. Malik didn't respond. He had learned early on that words were cheap in this place, actions, however, would carry weight. They always did. Their patrol car cruised through Augusta's west side, passing by boarded-up buildings and cracked sidewalks that seemed to whisper stories of neglect. Danny tapped the steering wheel in rhythm to the radio static, occasionally glancing at Malik, who remained focused on the streets ahead. "You don't talk much, do you?" she muttered finally. Malik glanced over and replied, calm and even, "Just listening." She chuckled dryly. "Yeah, well, careful who you listen to. This place'll get in your head if you let it." She didn't say it like a warning. It was more like a confession. A small window into a version of her that still remembered the line between right and wrong, but had long since stopped caring about it. Later that afternoon, they were called to respond to a reported disturbance involving a young black teenager accused of stealing snacks from a local gas station. By the time they arrived, Chad Barker was already on scene, standing over the boy with a hand hovering near his holster and an expression that barely masked his contempt. The kid couldn't have been more than 15. His hands were shaking. His back was pressed against the glass cooler behind him. "I said empty your pockets," Chad barked, his tone sharp, hostile. The clerk stood behind the counter, watching silently, arms crossed, unconcerned. Malik stepped forward slowly. "He's just a kid," he said calmly, making eye contact with the boy. "Let's all take a breath." Chad shot him a glance full of venom. "You new here, rookie. We don't coddle thieves." Malik's voice didn't rise. "He hasn't been searched. He hasn't said a word. He's not resisting. You're escalating." Chad took a step toward Malik, chest puffed. "You're in over your head, Thompson. Go wait in the car." The tension was thick, choking. Danny shifted awkwardly behind them. The boy looked like he might cry. Malik stepped between Chad and the teen, lowering his voice. "You put your hand on that weapon again, and we're going to have a different conversation. One that ends with your badge on my desk." Chad blinked, stunned for half a second before scoffing. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Malik didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the boy and extended his hand. "Come on. Let's go outside. Let's figure this out." That moment rippled. It changed something, not just for Chad, who stormed out red-faced, muttering curses, but for Danny, who watched with new eyes. She didn't say anything, but that evening, as they drove back to the station in silence, she broke it with a single sentence. "He was going to hurt that kid." Malik nodded. "Yeah. He was." And for the first time since arriving, she looked at him not with contempt, but with curiosity. Over the next few days, Malik noticed the shift. Whispers became sharper. Glances lasted longer. Reports he submitted were returned with red marks and vague criticisms. His access to case files was quietly restricted. The gatekeeping had intensified, and it wasn't subtle. He was being pushed out, not officially, not in a way that could be documented, but through 1,000 little acts designed to make him stumble. It was Chad's doing, clearly. The man had influence in that building, especially with Rick, who had taken to calling Malik Officer Silent, in front of the others. But Malik wasn't alone in noticing. Elijah, the janitor, stopped him one night as he exited the building. "Watch your back," he said simply. "They're stirring something." "You shook him up." Malik thanked him, his jaw tight. He knew retaliation was coming. What he didn't know was how far they'd go. One morning, a set of files landed on Malik's desk. Unusual files. Internal affairs complaints that had somehow been misplaced, but were now resurfaced, each one detailing misconduct by officers still serving. Some were recent. One even named Danny. Malik began reviewing them late into the night, piecing together a pattern, a timeline. His fingers hovered over his notepad as realization crept in. This wasn't just racism, it was a culture of silence, cultivated and protected by a network of loyalty and fear. When he confronted Rick, quietly, in his office, the older man didn't flinch. "You don't know what it takes to run a place like this," Rick said, pouring himself coffee like the conversation was casual. "You try to fix everything, you'll break it all. Some things are better left buried." Malik met his gaze. "Buried doesn't mean gone." Rick smiled coldly. "You want to be the hero, huh? Good luck surviving long enough to try." The next day, someone slashed the tires on Malik's patrol car. The day after that, an anonymous complaint was filed against him, accusing him of threatening another officer, an accusation that never made it into official reports but spread like wildfire through whispered conversations and conveniently timed stares. Even Danny seemed distant again, avoiding his eyes in the hallways, pulling back into the cocoon of silence she'd lived in before. Malik didn't blame her. The walls were closing in. But that night, in his apartment, he pulled out a black notebook. In it, he listed every name, every incident, every date. He marked them with symbols. Stars for those he thought could be saved. XS for those who couldn't. Circles for the ones who might change if they saw what was coming. He was almost ready. One more move. One more piece of evidence. He'd already made calls, quietly, strategically. The governor's liaison was on standby. Legal counsel had been briefed. The community outreach director had seen glimpses of what was brewing and wanted in. But Malik knew he needed one moment. One undeniable, unspinnable act of corruption. The kind that left no room for denial. And when it came, when it finally exploded, he wouldn't need to raise his voice. The truth would speak loud enough for everyone. And what they didn't know yet, what they were about to find out, was that the man they tried so hard to bury was the one holding the shovel. Because sometimes the real revolution doesn't come with fire and noise, it comes dressed in silence, with a badge and a plan. And now, the final piece was moving into place. But the question was, who would fall first? And just how far had the rot spread? The answer was coming. And it would leave them speechless. The morning Malik walked into the precinct wearing the same uniform he always had, nothing seemed different on the surface. The building still carried that faint staleness of burnt coffee and dust-covered silence. Phones rang. Keyboards clacked. Chad's voice echoed somewhere near the evidence room, laughing too loudly, as if the walls didn't hold tension tight. But Malik's steps felt heavier, more deliberate. Each stride pulled him closer to the moment he'd been preparing for. He had barely slept the night before, not because of fear, but because of the anticipation of truth finally coming out, truth given shape and voice. What they had built through arrogance and ignorance was about to collapse under the weight of its own corruption, and Malik would be the one holding the blueprint of the fallout. He walked straight to his desk, where a single manila envelope rested, placed carefully, almost respectfully. Inside it were the final pieces he needed: internal memos, falsified reports, and one signed statement from a civilian, witness to an incident that Chad and Holloway had successfully buried months ago. The witness had finally come forward after Malik arranged a safe and confidential channel through community outreach. It was all timed perfectly. The City Oversight Committee was scheduled to visit the station that afternoon under the guise of a routine evaluation. Malik had requested it himself, knowing full well how explosive it would become once the real purpose of their visit unfolded. The air shifted slightly when Malik entered the conference room. Chad, leaning back in his chair with his boots lazily kicked up on the table, didn't even look his way. Rick sat stiffly at the far end, arms crossed, eyes cold. Danny avoided eye contact, her expression unreadable. The others murmured their good mornings, but it felt hollow, obligatory. There was tension, but they hadn't recognized its source yet. They didn't know that today, everything was about to unravel. 10 minutes into the meeting, the doors opened and 3 people walked in, dressed in tailored suits with clipped smiles. The room fell silent. Rick stood up, clearly caught off guard. "This is unexpected," he said, forcing professionalism into his voice. "What's this about?" The man in the lead, a tall figure with gray temples and a badge clipped inside his blazer, simply replied, "We're here for a transparency review." "You've been notified." Rick's eyes darted to Malik, suspicion flaring like a match. Malik said nothing. The agents handed out sealed folders. Inside them, each officer found detailed logs of their assignments, case summaries, and, most importantly, complaints previously dismissed. Chad's folder was the thickest. He flipped through it, confusion growing, then frustration. "What is this? Where did you get this?" The agent didn't answer. He turned to Malik and said clearly, "Mr. Thompson, you may proceed." Chad blinked. "Mr. Who?" The silence that followed was seismic. Rick's jaw clenched. Danny straightened in her chair. The room felt like it had been dipped in ice. Malik stood slowly, deliberately, and walked to the front of the room. For the first time since setting foot in the 7th precinct, he didn't lower his eyes. He didn't soften his voice. He spoke clearly, calmly, with the weight of authority fully visible on his shoulders. "My name is Chief Malik Thompson. I've been appointed by the governor's office as the new commanding officer of this precinct. The documents in front of you are the results of a months-long internal investigation into misconduct, racial bias, and abuse of power within this department." He paused, scanning the room. The shock on their faces wasn't enough. He needed them to feel it. "Some of you have treated this uniform like armor against accountability. You've twisted it into a symbol of control rather than service. You've mocked, manipulated, and endangered both the public and your own colleagues. And now, you're going to answer for it." Chad stood abruptly, slamming the folder shut. "This is a setup. You're lying. This is bullshit." Malik turned to him without flinching. "You threatened a minor. You filed false reports. You intimidated witnesses. And you laughed in my face while doing it. You thought I was beneath you. You thought you could humiliate me, break me. But you were never looking at the whole picture." Rick's voice cut in, sharp and defensive. "You manipulated your way in here. You pretended to be one of us." "I was never one of you," Malik replied quietly. "Not in the ways that mattered." Danny stood slowly. Her voice was low. "Is this why you came here? To trap us?" Malik turned to her. I came here to see if there was anything worth saving. The room was suffocating now, heat rising, eyes darting. No one dared move. Chad's voice cracked with disbelief. This is career suicide. You think you can just waltz in here and throw us all under the bus? Malik walked over to him, stopping just a foot away. You threw yourself under the bus the moment you put power before people. The agents began calling names. One by one, officers were pulled aside, escorted to separate rooms for questioning. Legal counsel was made available. Rick was the last to be addressed. The agent didn't even bother to hand him the full file. We've reviewed your involvement extensively, he said. You'll be placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending further investigation. Rick's hands trembled slightly, but he forced a laugh. This won't stick. You think a bunch of papers and a rookie can take me down? Malik stepped closer. His voice softened, but the weight of it landed like iron. You took pride in being untouchable. But the truth is, no one's untouchable. Not when the right people are watching. As Rick was escorted out, silence settled once again. But it wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of reckoning. Of understanding that the story they thought they were living had just been rewritten. Malik returned to his seat. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Danny turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. You really were the chief the whole time. Malik nodded once. And you watched us, she said. Watched everything. Yes, he replied. She stared at him, eyes flickering with a mixture of shame and something else, respect, maybe. Or regret. You're not like them, she said. But you still let us show who we were. Malik looked her in the eyes. That was the point. Outside the precinct, protesters had begun to gather, holding signs, chanting. Not in anger, but in hope. Word had spread fast. Media vans were setting up along the sidewalk. What had once been a symbol of fear for many in the community was now the epicenter of a reckoning they had long prayed for. And inside, the man they had tried to erase had just turned the tide of an entire institution. But Malik knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As the halls of the 7th precinct settled into a stunned, aching silence, Malik remained still in the center of the storm he had calmly summoned. Officers avoided eye contact, murmurs barely dared to rise above a whisper, and the tension that once cloaked the station in swagger and false superiority now hung heavy with uncertainty and fear. The offices that had once echoed with laughter at his expense were now thick with an invisible weight, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the reality that nothing would ever be the same. Malik wasn't looking for revenge, this wasn't about ego. It was about truth. And truth, when delivered without anger, without raised voices or clenched fists, had a power that shook deeper than any outburst ever could. Outside, the chants grew louder. Malik walked out through the back, taking a breath of crisp Georgia air, the scent of pine and humidity mixing with distant sirens. He wasn't escaping the spotlight, he just needed a moment away from it. But even that quiet didn't last. A voice called from behind, hesitant but firm. You really planned all of this? It was Danny. She stood near the loading dock, her arms crossed, but her posture had changed. The defensiveness was gone, replaced by a kind of reluctant awe. Malik turned to her, his voice low. It wasn't just me. This has been coming for a long time. I just listened to the right people. She stepped forward, eyes darting like she was searching for something to hold on to. So, everything, the files, the oversight committee, the undercover thing, it was all real. This whole time, you were already in charge. Malik nodded once. Danny let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. I should have known. You never flinched. Not once. Even when they went after you, hell, even when I didn't speak up. Her voice cracked slightly, and she looked down. I let it happen. I didn't join in, but I didn't stop it either. That makes me just as bad, doesn't it? Malik took a long breath, watching her. Silence doesn't make you bad. But it does make you responsible. The moment you know better, you have to do better. And now you know. She looked up at him, something behind her eyes flickering, guilt, maybe, or the heavy ache of a conscience waking up. What now? She asked. Malik glanced toward the parking lot, where another news van had just pulled in. Now, we clean up. We rebuild. She stepped closer. Do you really think it can change? This place? Malik met her gaze. It has to. Back inside, Chad paced a holding room like a caged animal, sweat on his forehead, fury in every step. He had just watched his world implode from the inside out, his authority stripped, his alliances dissolving like sand in water. And now he sat in a cold room, being told by a young agent that he was under review for misconduct that had been hidden for years, but documented now with brutal clarity. The agent asked a question, and Chad barked back, "You think this is justice? This is a witch hunt." I was doing my job. The agent didn't flinch. Your job isn't to intimidate citizens or falsify records. Your job is to protect and serve. And you failed both. Chad leaned forward, eyes wide. You don't know what it's like out there. People lie. They spit in our faces. They push us, and we're supposed to just smile and take it. The agent replied calmly, "There's a difference between control and accountability. You chose control." Moments later, Malik entered the room. Chad straightened up, his jaw clenched. "So you're the big man now. You think you're better than us?" Malik sat across from him, locking eyes with no trace of hatred, only exhaustion. "I don't need to be better than you, Chad. I just needed to be better than who you thought I was." Chad shook his head. "This place doesn't change. You think a few speeches and a badge mean anything? These people, this town, they'll forget about you in a year." Malik's voice was steady. "Maybe. But change doesn't need to be remembered to be real. It just needs to happen." Chad leaned back, his voice lower now, almost confessional. "You knew the whole time we'd come after you, didn't you? That we'd try to break you." Malik nodded. "I didn't have to predict it. I lived it." Chad scoffed. "You think you can fix this department with paperwork and morals? You'll burn out." Malik stood slowly, eyes unwavering. "Then I'll burn out doing something that mattered. Can you say the same?" Down the hall, Rick Holloway sat with another investigator, his tie loosened, eyes bloodshot. His voice was low, bitter. "We held the line. That's what we did. We kept things in order." The investigator scribbled something, not responding. Rick slammed a hand on the table. "You can't just erase decades of law enforcement culture and replace it with feel-good slogans." From the doorway, Malik answered. "No one's erasing the past, Rick. We're just making sure it doesn't repeat." Rick looked up, weary now, the bravado draining from him. "You don't get it. We were trained to survive, not to serve. We were told that being feared meant being safe." Malik stepped into the room. "And that fear has cost this city more than you'll ever understand." Rick's voice softened, almost apologetic. "We weren't always like this." Malik didn't argue. He simply said, "Then maybe you should have remembered who you were before the badge turned into a weapon." Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the low skyline of Augusta and the precinct stood eerily quiet, Malik gathered the remaining officers in the briefing room. Some had been cleared. Some were still under review. Most sat in silence, their expressions a mixture of confusion, guilt, and an unspoken question: what happens next? Malik stood at the front, not with triumph, but with clarity. "Some of you are angry. Some of you feel betrayed. And some of you know deep down that this change was overdue. This department isn't dead, but it is transforming. We will be better. We will serve better. We will lead better. And if you can't be part of that, you should walk away now. No one moved. Malik continued, voice low and firm. You laughed at me. You ignored me. You tested me. And still, I'm here. Not because I needed to prove anything to you. But because I believed this city deserved better. He looked around the room. This is not the end of your careers. But it is the end of the silence. You can choose what comes next. After the meeting, Danny approached him again, standing with her hands in her pockets. Her eyes were softer now. So, you're staying? She asked. I am, Malik said. You really think we can turn this place around? She asked. Malik offered a quiet smile. Only if we do it together. And for the first time since he walked through the precinct doors, someone from inside extended a hand, not in mockery, not in resistance, but in hope. Danny held out her hand, and Malik shook it. Outside, the city still buzzed. Reporters filed stories. Residents watched with cautious optimism. The future wasn't certain. The road ahead would be hard. But something had shifted. Not in policy. Not just in leadership. In spirit. And deep in the halls of the 7th precinct, change had found a voice. And it was speaking, loud, clear, and impossible to ignore. The days that followed the revelation didn't bring immediate celebration or closure, they brought a slow, grinding reckoning that spread through the precinct like smoke after a long-awaited fire. Officers once loud and brash now moved through the station with measured steps, avoiding the corners they used to dominate with their presence. Conversations became whispers, and laughter, when it came, felt forced. The power dynamic had shifted, but its weight still lingered in the air, thick and complicated. Malik walked those same halls with a different presence now, not heavier, not grander, but undeniable. He wasn't hiding anymore, and with that came a silent demand, face what's been done, and choose what you'll become. The disciplinary hearings began in a closed room upstairs, run by Internal Affairs alongside state-appointed legal observers. Chad was the first to face formal charges, and while many expected his arrogance to hold, what unfolded behind that door was something else entirely. In the privacy of that cold, beige room, the man who once strutted through the precinct like he owned it cracked under the weight of his own actions. Faced with evidence he couldn't dispute, recordings he had no idea even existed, testimonies from officers he believed loyal, he found himself naked in the truth. Malik didn't sit in on the hearing, but he received updates through the chain of command. Chad wasn't apologetic, but the bravado had vanished, replaced by something much quieter, the creeping understanding that his downfall was his own doing. Rick's case was different. His decades of service didn't grant him immunity, it only widened the scope of the investigation. While he hadn't left fingerprints on every incident, his fingerprints were on the system itself. The manipulation of internal processes, the intimidation of whistleblowers, the subtle, intentional redirection of complaints, none of it was violent, but all of it was corrosive. And while Rick never publicly confessed, the state found enough evidence to justify his suspension pending further action. When he left the precinct for the last time, his walk was slow, his shoulders no longer squared, and his badge, surrendered without resistance, felt heavier than it had ever been while pinned to his chest. Danny's position became a source of debate. She hadn't been a perpetrator, but she hadn't been a protector either. Malik watched her closely in those days, not because he doubted her potential, but because he recognized the internal war playing out behind her silence. One afternoon, she knocked on his office door and sat down without asking. Her voice was low, her expression tired. She admitted that she had known about incidents, even if only in fragments. She had laughed when she shouldn't have, walked away when she could have stepped in. She asked Malik plainly, "Do I deserve to stay?" It was a question without a clear answer, and Malik didn't rush to give one. Instead, he offered her what he hadn't received during his first weeks at the precinct, a chance to prove who she could be now. He told her that staying would mean accountability, transparency, and an active role in reforming the department. There would be no more silence, no more safe neutrality. Danny agreed. And from that day forward, something in her shifted. She started showing up early, volunteering for community assignments, and, perhaps most importantly, she began listening. Not to the voices inside the station, but to those outside, the ones who had been ignored for too long. Malik's vision for the precinct wasn't just about cleaning house. It was about building something new. He began hosting weekly town hall meetings in the community center a few blocks away from the station. There, residents could voice concerns, ask questions, challenge decisions. And Malik listened, not with defensiveness, but with an openness that many found disarming. He knew that rebuilding trust would take more than speeches, it would take presence, patience, and proof. During one of those meetings, an older woman stood up and said, "I've lived in this neighborhood 40 years and never once felt safe calling the police. But I came tonight to see if that's finally changing." Malik responded not with promises, but with an invitation. "Help me make sure it does." Internally, the culture of the station began to bend. Not break, not overnight, but bend. Officers who had quietly disagreed with the toxic leadership before now felt permission to speak, to act. A young officer named Jordan, barely 2 years into his career, came to Malik's office one evening and admitted that he'd nearly quit 6 months earlier because of the environment. "But now," he said, "it feels like maybe this badge means something again." Malik didn't smile, but his nod carried the weight of earned progress. Still, not everyone was ready for change. Some officers remained bitter, skeptical. They did their jobs, but the respect was surface level, their loyalty thin. Malik didn't try to win them over with charm or manipulation. He just stayed consistent. Every decision, every correction, every initiative came back to the same standard: dignity, responsibility, and truth. And over time, the resistance lost its shape. Because it's hard to fight a man who simply shows up, does the work, and holds the mirror up to the institution he's trying to fix. But beneath the surface of reform, a deeper question began to grow in Malik's mind, one he rarely voiced, but which clung to him in quiet moments alone: what is the cost of becoming the symbol? What toll does it take to carry both the hope and the anger of a city on your shoulders? He never asked for that role, but now that it had found him, he couldn't ignore the burden. And in that weight was a moral dilemma that gnawed at the edges of his strength. Could he lead a department that had once tried to destroy him without losing the very humanity that had allowed him to endure it? Could he offer redemption to those who had shown him none? The question crystallized during a meeting with the city's police oversight board. They praised the reforms, the improved metrics, the public response. One board member suggested fast-tracking new funding to expand community programs. Another hinted at public recognition, a ceremony, maybe a medal. Malik sat still as they spoke, feeling the irony settle in his chest. They were celebrating a turnaround, but they hadn't walked through the fire. They hadn't felt the sting of humiliation, the loneliness of being the only one standing against the tide. They hadn't heard the laughter that haunted him still. After the meeting, Malik walked alone down a long hallway, hands in his pockets. At the end of the corridor, through a small window, he could see the back of the station, the same spot where Chad had once told him to stay in his place. That place no longer existed. But what had taken its place was something more complex than victory. It was justice, yes. It was necessary. But it wasn't clean. It wasn't triumphant. It was human, flawed, heavy, and unfinished. One night, Malik returned to his apartment and found a handwritten note slipped under his door. It read simply, "I didn't speak up when I should have. I'm sorry. But I'm ready now." There was no signature, but he recognized the handwriting. It was from one of the silent officers who had once laughed and looked away. Malik folded the note, placed it inside the same black notebook where he had once listed names, dates, and offenses. He no longer marked people with stars or XS. The lines between guilt and growth had blurred. And in that blur, something powerful lived: redemption, not as a gift, but as a choice. He sat by the window that night, staring at the city lights. The world outside looked the same, but he knew something inside it had shifted. Tomorrow, there would be more challenges. More questions. More days where progress would feel like a slow march rather than a celebration. But for the first time since he arrived, Malik didn't feel like he was walking alone. The silence of the past had been shattered. And now, in its place, something was rising. Something uncertain. Something hopeful. And the final chapter was still waiting to be written. It had been 3 weeks since the internal restructuring of the 7th precinct began, and while the station no longer echoed with the same toxic bravado it once did, it was far from quiet. The energy had changed, uncertain, watchful, but not hostile. Malik had replaced the climate of arrogance with a culture of accountability, and yet, beneath the calm surface, there was still unrest. Not the loud, confrontational kind, but the type that lives in glances, in unfinished sentences, in unspoken fears. He could feel it in the way people lingered outside his office before knocking, in the way rookie officers spoke with hesitation, unsure whether this new order was real or temporary. Every step forward invited the shadow of doubt, and Malik knew better than to ignore it. He found himself spending more time in the common spaces of the precinct, not to monitor, but to be present. He joined the evening briefings, walked the halls during late shifts, took his lunch in the same cramped break room where jokes about him used to fly without consequence. It was during one of those moments, coffee cup in hand, leaning against the counter, that Officer Jordan approached him again. The young man seemed nervous, his fingers tapping the edge of a chair. Malik looked at him calmly and asked what was on his mind. Jordan hesitated, then said he'd been asked by a couple of older officers if he really thought all this change was gonna stick. His voice was low, uncertain. Malik asked him what he told them. Jordan replied, "I said I hope it does. I said I want it to. But I don't know if hope's enough." Malik nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the window. He answered not with a lecture but with honesty. He said hope wasn't a strategy, but it was a starting point. He said change wasn't a firework, it was erosion, slow and often invisible, but powerful if it kept moving. Jordan listened, and something in his shoulders relaxed. It wasn't assurance, but it was truth. That night, Malik wrote a note in his journal: "Change doesn't need to be loud to be irreversible." One afternoon, he received an unexpected call. It was from Elijah, the janitor, the same man who had warned him, quietly, with nothing but truth in his eyes. Malik hadn't seen much of him since the restructuring began, but his voice over the phone was steady. He asked Malik to meet him outside the old church on Green Street. No explanation. Just a time and a place. Malik arrived just after sundown, the sky burning orange behind the rusted steeple. Elijah stood leaning on the railing, his work boots dusty, his hands folded. He didn't speak right away, just watched the horizon. Then he said, almost as if he were thinking aloud, that change in a place like this didn't just start in precincts or city halls, it started in the corners, in the kitchens, in the barbershops and classrooms where people had stopped believing they mattered. He turned to Malik and asked him if he truly understood what it meant to be the face of something people had stopped hoping for. Malik didn't answer at first. The weight of that question wasn't rhetorical, it was spiritual. Elijah went on to tell him that the community wasn't just watching him, they were leaning on him, holding their breath, waiting for proof that this moment wasn't just another promise dressed in new clothes. Malik admitted that the pressure was real, that some days it felt too much, that part of him worried what might happen if he failed. Elijah smiled faintly, not with pity, but with recognition. He said, "Then you're right where you're supposed to be. If it didn't scare you, it wouldn't be real." The next morning, Malik called a closed meeting in the precinct with the remaining senior staff. It was time, he said, to move from reaction to responsibility. He introduced a proposal for a full transparency initiative, body cam uploads to public access databases, civilian ride-alongs, and regular psychological evaluations for all officers. The room went still. A few faces twitched with discomfort. Danny shifted in her seat, her eyes scanning the room before settling on Malik. She asked the question everyone was thinking, do you really think they'll accept it? Malik responded that the question wasn't about acceptance, it was about obligation. If they weren't willing to be seen, they had no business serving. There was pushback. Officer Graham, one of the few left from the old guard, argued that transparency was just a trap, one mistake on camera, and your career could be over. Malik looked him in the eyes and said that if one mistake could end your career, then you hadn't built it on integrity. The words landed like a stone in water, sending silent ripples through the room. Later that day, Danny caught up with Malik in the hallway. She walked beside him for a few moments before speaking. I've been thinking about what you said. About the difference between acceptance and obligation. Malik glanced at her. She continued, it's not just about what the public needs. It's about who we become when no one's watching. You're asking us to be that version of ourselves all the time. That's not easy. Malik nodded. No, it's not. But it's necessary. She looked down for a moment, then back at him. I'm in. I want to help lead this. Not because I think I'm ready, but because I think I need to become someone who is. Malik didn't smile, but his eyes warmed. Then let's begin. The precinct began to change from the inside. Officers were given workshops on conflict de-escalation, implicit bias, and ethical decision-making. Outside consultants were brought in, not to preach, but to listen and collaborate. It wasn't perfect. There were complaints. Some officers transferred out quietly. A few turned in their badges. But those who remained started to reflect the mission, not just obey it. Malik watched as people who once viewed their job as survival began to see it as service again. One evening, as the station wound down, Malik stepped outside to the front steps. A small group of teenagers was gathered across the street, watching. One of them called out, "You really the new chief?" Malik raised his hand in acknowledgement. The boy laughed and shouted, "My mama said you made the cops scared." The others laughed too, but not mockingly. There was something else in it, something like admiration. Malik crossed the street and asked them their names, where they went to school, what they wanted to be. One of them, a girl with braids and an old backpack, said she wanted to be a lawyer. Another said he wanted to be like the guy in the suit on the news, a reference to Malik, though he didn't say it directly. Malik told them they could be anything, but only if they believed their lives mattered even when the world tried to say otherwise. He told them the system hadn't always seen them, but that didn't mean they weren't worth seeing. They asked him if being chief was hard. He said yes, and that anything worth doing usually was. They nodded, and after a few minutes, they left, but not before one of them turned back and said, "Don't quit, all right?" That night, Malik sat in his office alone, lights dim, the hum of the building settling into quiet. He opened his notebook, not the black one where he used to track wrongdoing, but a new one. In it, he began to write names. Names of those who had changed. Those who had stayed. Those who had chosen to believe again. And at the top of the page, he wrote a single word, legacy. He knew the work was far from over. He knew there would be days ahead filled with resistance, missteps, and pressure. But he also knew something unshakable had been built in the aftermath of the storm, not a perfect system, but a real one. And within it, a new kind of strength was growing. One not built on silence or control, but on presence, truth, and the quiet, stubborn power of resilience. The air had changed inside the 7th precinct, not in the loud, celebratory way some might expect after a storm passes, but in that quiet, settled way the world breathes after a long-held tension finally releases. Malik moved through the building now not as a stranger, not as a target, but as a presence that held weight, earned, not demanded. The corridors didn't echo with the same tight laughter that once cut through every silence. There was still skepticism, yes, still fatigue in the eyes of some, but it was no longer a place rotting from within. It was growing. Unevenly, uncomfortably, but undeniably growing. It was a Monday afternoon when Malik noticed something had truly shifted. He had just wrapped a roundtable with junior officers, men and women who had joined the force after most of the scandal had come to light. One of them, Officer Samuels, a young black woman with a fierce intelligence and a quiet fire, stayed behind. She didn't speak right away. Malik waited. Finally, she looked at him and said, "I didn't think I could be a cop. Not after what I saw growing up. Not after what happened to my uncle." Her eyes didn't blink. "But then I saw you. On the news. And I thought maybe someone like me could wear the badge and not feel like I was wearing someone else's skin." Malik's chest tightened. Not with pride, but with something deeper, responsibility. He told her what he wished someone had told him when he first put on the uniform, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was stepping forward in spite of it, for something greater than yourself. She nodded, and in that simple moment, Malik knew that whatever battles lay ahead, this one mattered. This one had roots. Later that same week, a citywide report was released detailing the changes inside the 7th precinct, the ripple effect it had already begun to have in other departments statewide, and the increased participation of local citizens in community forums. The data spoke volumes: reduced civilian complaints, improved response protocols, increased officer wellness check-ins. But the numbers weren't what made the most noise, it was the stories. Stories of people who had once been afraid to call the police now sitting in the same room with them, voicing their concerns, sharing their pain, and, for the first time in a long time, being heard. Still, not everyone was cheering. At the fringes of the department, officers who had avoided direct involvement in past misconduct but who had grown comfortable in its shadow began to express quiet dissent. Some grumbled about too much accountability and not enough protection for the officers on the street. Malik heard it, of course. He always did. And instead of confronting it with punishment, he confronted it with presence. He walked with them during late shifts, rode patrol in neighborhoods still carrying wounds, and spoke to them not as their superior, but as a man who understood what it meant to carry the weight of the badge. One night, during a particularly tense shift, Malik found himself riding with Officer Harris, a man in his early 50s who had remained largely silent through the months of change. Harris had been in the department long enough to remember when the locker rooms were filled with unchecked jokes and unwritten rules. Malik had always sensed something brewing in him, not resistance, but a complicated kind of shame. As they drove through the quiet streets of Augusta, Harris finally spoke. He didn't look at Malik when he said it. "I knew it was wrong. Back then. The way they talked. The way they treated people. I didn't like it. But I didn't stop it either." His voice was low, brittle. "I told myself I wasn't part of it, because I wasn't saying the things they said. But I was just letting it happen. Watching." Malik didn't respond right away. The cruiser hummed gently beneath them. Then he said, "Silence doesn't always mean consent. Sometimes it just means fear. And fear, especially in a place like this, can take years to name." Harris nodded slowly. "I see you now. And I think maybe if you had been here back then, maybe things would have been different." Malik turned to him and answered with the same calm strength he always carried. "Maybe. Or maybe it's because of everything that didn't change back then, that it finally had to now." Harris swallowed hard, and though he said nothing more, the silence between them was no longer empty. It held accountability. And something that looked like healing. The following week, Malik received an invitation from the mayor's office to speak at the Regional Leadership Summit for Public Safety. He hadn't asked for that platform, hadn't lobbied for it. But the invitation came with sincerity, and it carried a simple message: your voice matters here. Danny was the first to encourage him to go. She'd grown into a different kind of officer in the months since the reckoning, more present, more vocal, less guarded. She told him she believed the rest of the state needed to hear what happened in their precinct. That it wasn't about exposing the past anymore, it was about modeling what redemption could look like. Malik was hesitant. Not because he was afraid of speaking, but because part of him still wrestled with whether the battle inside one building was enough to represent something broader. He didn't want to become a symbol detached from the people he served. The night before the summit, Malik walked through the precinct one last time before locking his office. He passed by the roll call room, where a new motto now hung on the back wall, words suggested by Officer Samuels, voted on by the department, and painted with care: to listen, to serve, to be accountable. He stopped in front of it, read the words again, and realized something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge until then: this building, once toxic with tradition, was now echoing with the voices of those it once silenced. And not just the voices of the officers, but of the people who lived in the city, who had demanded something better. At the summit, Malik took the stage not with scripted notes, but with a folded piece of paper that held only 3 sentences he wanted to remember. He spoke not like a politician, not like a polished speaker, but like a man who had lived through fire and come out marked, but whole. He spoke about humility. About justice that wasn't loud, but consistent. About the pain of being underestimated and the power of being unbroken. He spoke about accountability, not as punishment, but as a mirror. And most importantly, he spoke about grace. How it must be earned, but also offered. The room didn't erupt in applause. It sat in stillness. A quiet, reflective kind of awe. When he finished, a woman approached him in the hallway. She was from a neighboring county, a community organizer who had been battling her local police department for years. She said to him, "You didn't just change a precinct. You changed the way we see what's possible." Malik thanked her, but in his heart, he carried something more important than praise: he carried proof. Proof that people could change. That systems could shift. That leadership wasn't about being feared, but about being trusted. Back in Augusta, the precinct continued its slow transformation. Malik implemented an anonymous feedback system for both officers and civilians. He began inviting former inmates to speak at training seminars, giving officers a chance to hear how their actions echoed beyond a single arrest. He partnered with local schools to create early intervention programs for youth on the edge of the system. One morning, he sat with a group of teenagers in a small classroom where they asked him questions without filters. One boy, about 13, asked him, "What do you do when people still don't respect you, even after everything you did?" Malik looked at him and said, "I stay standing. Because I'm not here for their respect. I'm here for your future." That answer stayed with him long after the classroom emptied. It became the seed of something deeper. Because change was no longer just a responsibility. It had become a legacy. And Malik wasn't carrying it alone anymore. He had passed it on, piece by piece, voice by voice. And soon, it would be time to let that legacy speak for itself. Months passed, and what once felt like a fractured institution began to resemble something whole. Not polished, not pristine, but human. The 7th precinct had become more than a cautionary tale, it was living proof that accountability and change were not only possible, but sustainable. Malik stood at the heart of it, not as a figurehead, but as a man whose journey had burned away everything superficial, leaving behind only truth. And in truth, he had found a purpose deeper than reform. He had found legacy. The station now operated under a new model of transparency, and for the first time in its history, the Civilian Oversight Board shared real power over internal affairs decisions. It was a radical shift, and not everyone embraced it. But those who stayed learned to lead with their ears as much as their hands. Chad Barker, once so loud and untouchable, had faced formal charges and resigned before a conviction could be made. He vanished from Augusta, his name stripped from the plaques and records, his legacy replaced with a public acknowledgement of the harm he'd done. No press conference, no redemption arc, just the silence of consequence. That silence was the justice Malik knew some people would never understand, but it was real. Rick Holloway, older and visibly worn by the fallout, moved out of the public eye entirely. Retirement papers came through quietly. What surprised everyone was his final action before leaving, a signed statement confirming the existence of internal manipulation under his leadership. It wasn't a full confession, but it was enough to allow multiple suppressed investigations to reopen. It was his way of conceding, not asking for forgiveness, but recognizing the truth too late. It didn't cleanse him, but it closed a chapter. Danny Reeves, once caught between silence and survival, became one of the most trusted leaders in the department. She led the new officer mentorship program, pairing veterans with rookies not to teach control, but to teach care. She carried with her the weight of knowing she had once looked away, and she never let herself forget it. That memory didn't make her weak, it made her vigilant. Her relationship with Malik evolved into a quiet partnership based on respect and unspoken understanding. They didn't need to talk about what they'd both endured to know how deeply it had shaped them. Her voice became essential in shaping training programs that focused on empathy and accountability. One day, in a citywide town hall, a local parent thanked her publicly for saving her son's life, not from violence, but from being misunderstood. That moment said more than any commendation ever could. Elijah, the janitor who had offered Malik that first thread of solidarity, retired not long after the precinct stabilized. At his farewell, Malik gave him a simple gift, a copy of the new departmental code of ethics, printed and framed, signed by every current officer. In the bottom corner, handwritten by Malik, were the words, "Because someone like you reminded me not to break." Elijah smiled as he read it and said, "Then it was worth showing up all those years." As for Malik, the weight on his shoulders had never lightened, but it had shifted. He had been offered promotions, media deals, even book contracts. But he turned them all down. He wasn't interested in becoming a symbol for sale. What he wanted was peace. A kind earned, not awarded. He accepted a position on the governor's Public Safety Council but insisted it be a part-time advisory role. He chose to stay in Augusta, to continue leading the precinct, not because he needed the title, but because this was the place where the truth had been tested, and where, somehow, it had survived. He walked the neighborhoods weekly, sometimes in uniform, sometimes not. He listened to stories. He remembered names. People saw him not as an outsider anymore, but as someone who had bled with them and stayed anyway. One child, the same one who once shouted at him across the street, now wore a T-shirt with the precinct's logo and told him, "When I grow up, I want to work with you." Malik knelt down, looked the boy in the eye, and said, "Then you better be ready to lead with your heart." It was during a quiet Saturday morning that Malik received the final closure he didn't know he needed. He had stopped at the corner diner, sitting alone with a black coffee and the local paper. An older man sat at the next table, worn hands, hard eyes. He looked familiar. It took Malik a moment to place him. It was Harris, the officer who had once sat silently through the worst of it all. Harris didn't greet him with words. He just raised his coffee cup and gave a small nod. Malik returned it. No speech, no apology. Just acknowledgement. And that was enough. Because sometimes justice doesn't come wrapped in victory. It comes in moments like that. In the nod of a man who once chose silence, now recognizing the cost of it. And that's where the story finds its final beat, not in thunder, but in echo. Not in revenge, but in restoration. The 7th precinct didn't become perfect. It became accountable. And Malik? He didn't just change a department. He redefined what it meant to belong, even in a place that once tried to make him disappear. Now, to you, the one who listened to this story from beginning to end. Think for a moment about what it means to be seen, not just watched. To be respected, not just tolerated. What would you do if you were in Malik's position? Would you stay quiet, or would you rise in the face of mockery, not with fire, but with patience, and with truth? Have you ever been underestimated? What did you do with that? Or maybe you've been on the other side, watching something wrong happen and choosing to say nothing. What if you had one more chance to make it right? This story isn't just about a precinct. It's about us. About the world we tolerate and the one we want to create. So tell us, what part of this story moved you most? And what would you have done if you were standing in Malik's shoes? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. Let's grow from it. And if you felt this story hit something real in you, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories just like this, raw, powerful, human. Don't forget to hit the like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for listening.